terms of the living under Nazi rule unit, it's split up into five subsections, 5 units. The first one is about dictatorship, how Hitler establishes his control between 1933 and 1934 and how he establishes that dictatorship. The second unit is all about how they control people, what systems in place like propaganda and terror do they use to control people. The third is all about how they change people's lives, so lives for women, lives for workers. How do they change lives of young people? How do they change the lives of German people? The fourth unit focuses on Germany in the war. So what is life like in Germany during World War II? So between 1939 and 1945. And then the fifth unit is all about the Nazi occupation of Europe. So how do they treat the places that they occupy? How do they treat the people that they occupy? What happens in the Holocaust, and then people who sort of resist the Nazis, people who support them, people who collaborate with them in the occupied countries. So we'll start with dictatorship, which is from 1933 to 1934. Now, some of the aims of the Nazi Party were detailed on the screen here, but the key ones are these four. They wanted to abolish the Treaty of Versailles. Germany, and in particular Hitler, hated the Treaty of Versailles. He viewed the people who signed it, the Weimar government, he viewed them as the November criminals. So their aims were to abolish the Treaty of Versailles, to make Germany a world power, to provide the German people with work and bread, and to remove undesirable people from society, such as Jews and communists. So people who they opposed racially, such as Jewish people, and people who they opposed politically, such as the communists. Now, the first big event in Hitler's chancellorship is just less than a month after he has been chancellor. So he becomes chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. On the 27th of February 1933, there is a fire at the Reichstag. Now remember, the Reichstag is the German Parliament building. So there's a Reichstag at the German Parliament there's a fire, at the German Parliament building, and there's a communist called Marinus van der Lubbe, and he is blamed for doing the fire. Some people believe he was framed, some people believe it was done by the Nazis. But either way, if it was a coincidence, the Nazis used the Reichstag fire as a great opportunity to reduce people's freedoms. So after the Reichstag fire, they passed the Reichstag Fire Decree. Now, the Reichstag Fire Decree is a law which removes people's personal freedoms. So it removes free speech, it removes the right to assemble in a public place, and it also takes a lot of the local power from local governments and puts it more in the hands of the central government. So basically, they used the Reichstag fire to pass this emergency decree, which removes people's personal freedoms and gives the central government more power. Soon after, on the 24th of March 1933, Hitler passes the Enabling Act. Now, the Enabling Act is what Hitler has been working towards. The Enabling Act gives Hitler the right to pass any laws without the support of the Reichstag. So in essence, it means that he doesn't need the agreement of other politicians. He can simply make laws without the Reichstag's approval. So on the 24th of March 1933, the politicians go into the Reichstag to vote. Hitler places SA soldiers all around the Reichstag to intimidate the politicians into voting for it. Now, many of the leading communists have been arrested and they have been taken away. So they are not able to vote against Hitler's Enabling Act. So the Enabling Act passes and it makes Hitler, in essence, the dictator of Germany. So the Reichstag votes itself out of existence, where it votes itself to be completely without power. So it takes the power from the Reichstag and puts it into Hitler's hands. So the people no longer have power because they can't vote for who they want in the Reichstag, because the Reichstag has been, in essence, closed in terms of its activity, and the power is placed in the hands of Hitler. Now, the Nazis want to Nazify society, and this process of Gleichschaltung is all about social coordination. So we pick out 4 key things that the Nazis do to coordinate society into what they want it to be, to Nazify society into what they want it to be. The first thing they do is the Civil Service Act. Now, people who work in universities, people who are teachers, many of them, people who work in the government, people who are not Aryan, so people who are not of pure German blood, particularly Jewish people, are fired from their jobs as part of the Civil Service Act. So they're removing people that they view as politically unreliable. They're removing them from society. The second thing they do is they encourage anti-Semitism. So the government are officially encouraging anti-Semitism. Jews are targeted, and the businesses are boycotted. So they deliberately boycott Jewish businesses, and the government encourage this to sort of develop hostility and to develop ill feeling towards Jewish people. The third thing that they do for Gleichschaltung is about book burning. Now, they want to control the ideas that people are reading and that people have access to. So any books that are deemed as politically unreliable are destroyed. So books written by Jewish people, books written by communists, books which undermine German values, they are burnt. The last element of Gleichschaltung is about their use of terror. They use groups like the SA, the SS, the Gestapo and the SD to terrify people into complying with their instructions. So to terrify people and to create a culture of fear so that people are fearful of opposing them, and therefore they just do as they want. Now, in terms of the changes to local governance, the Nazis and Hitler believe that the most important thing is to have a single, central, powerful government. They do not want local areas to have their own power. They want to have all of the power centrally, because if they have the power, they can control exactly what's happening. So there's changes to the local governance in order to do this. So the power of the local government was totally removed, and it was given to the Nazis in the central government. Local regions didn't now have their own laws. They had to follow the national laws of the Nazis. So this gives the Nazis centralized control over Germany. So they've got that power. These local regions like the Munich region and the Hamburg region, the Bavarian government where Munich's the centre, the Bavarian government no longer have power because that power has been given to the central government. The People's Court was also set up, and the People's Court is partly to do with governance and partly to do with terror. The People's Court is set up to deal with political offences. So political offences is deliberately vague. So really, a political offence in the Nazis' eyes is anything against the Nazis or anything that undermines them. So this is separate to normal courts. If you committed a burglary or you robbed someone, that you would be dealt with in a normal political court. But political offences are now dealt with in this People's Court. The People's Court would almost always result in the death penalty. So it was a way of the Nazis physically removing people that were committing the political offences. Now, we fast forward to the 30th of June 1934. Okay, so 30th of June 1934, Adolf Hitler organises the Night of the Long Knives. Now, in the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler removes the leading political figures who are his enemies and Ernst Röhm. Now, we'll start with Ernst Röhm. Ernst Röhm was the leader of the SA. It had 3 million men in the SA, and he was increasingly becoming a threat to Hitler. Hitler thought that the SA was becoming too powerful, too difficult to handle. It had 3 million men in it. So Rome had been publicly undermining Hitler, and so Hitler decided that Rome needed to be dealt with. So Rome was arrested and killed. At the same time, other political opponents were arrested or killed. So other leading political figures like Franz von Papen, they were forced to give up their political positions. Otherwise, they knew that they too would be killed. Now, the consequences of the Night of the Long Knives are quite significant. The first thing is that the power of the SA is reduced. So Hitler reduces the power of the SA, he takes away their leader, he kills their leader, and he reduces their power. And over the next year or two, the number of soldiers in the SA decreases quite significantly. The second consequence of the Night of the Long Knives is that the army almost pledged their loyalty to Hitler. Hitler has a choice. Does he choose the SA, his brown shirts, or does he choose the army? And because Hitler chooses the army over the SA and has Rome killed, the army becomes incredibly loyal to Hitler. He gains their loyalty and their trust, and that's really important going forwards. The third consequence is probably for regular people, everyday Germans, is the most important. The consequences of the Night of the Long Knives, it creates a culture of fear and terror. The Nazis literally go to Munich, arrest Rome and kill him. They go to Berlin, they arrest Franz von Papen and they threaten him. And there are other political figures who are killed as well. So it makes it normal for people to be arrested, to disappear, to be killed. So it creates a culture of fear led by Himmler in Germany. And this is really important for the Nazis establishing that culture of fear that they use to control the people. In terms of removing opposition, the Nazis' real remaining big form of opposition, now that they've removed the communists with the Reichstag fire, they've removed political opponents in the Night of the Long Knives, they've removed Ernst Röhm and the threat that he's presenting. Hitler has taken all of the power with the Enabling Act. The final form of opposition really is the trade unions. Now, trade unions traditionally are more politically leaning towards communists, and they will defend the rights of workers against the government. Now, Hitler wants complete control. He doesn't want trade unions standing up to him. So he has to do something about them. So the way that they manage and close down the trade unions is by conning them. They fool them. So they agree with the trade unions a Labour Day. So a day off work where German workers celebrate their efforts and they have a day off. Now on this Labour Day, the main leaders of the trade unions send their workers and they have a day of celebration. Now on this Labour Day, the trade union offices are raided and they are closed down. Leading trade union members or sort of leaders of trade unions are arrested and they completely close down the trade unions. So they fool the trade unions into thinking that they are supporting them, that the Nazis are supporting the trade unions. But actually what they do is they use the Labour Day as an opportunity to raid the offices, to seize their assets and to close them down. All of the assets, all of the things that the trade unions owned were taken by the Nazis and were put under a group called the German Labour Front, the DAF. Now, unsurprisingly, the DAF, this new trade union, is controlled by the Nazis. And they make it very, very difficult for workers if they're not a member of the DAF. So they have now got control of workers because they have closed down all of the trade unions that would have stood up to the Nazis, and they've created their own trade union called the German Labour Front, which members really need to be a part of if they want to get a job. In terms of other political parties, the Social Democrats are their main opposition to the Nazis still. So the communists are dealt with after the Reichstag fire, but the Social Democrats are still hanging about and being a nuisance to the Nazis. So they pass a law called the Act to Ban New Parties. And this is really the final nail in the coffin, where the Act to Ban New Parties makes it illegal to be a member of any other political organisation. So it makes Germany a one-party state. So if you want to be a member of a political party, it can only be the Nazis. And at that point, it is illegal to be a member of any other party. So they're removing every element of opposition that they can. The second unit is all about control and how they control people's lives. And again, this is from 1933, when Hitler is elected as Chancellor, so on the 30th of January 1933, all the way through to the outbreak of war in 1939. Now, the police state is a really important part of Nazi control and how they control people's lives. And the three key elements of that police state are the SD, the SS, and the Gestapo. Now, I'll talk about them in a bit more detail in a minute, but simply, the SD are the Secret Service. They are the intelligence gathering network. They gather intelligence, they spy on people, they tap people's phones, and they then pass that information on, usually to the Gestapo. The SS are Hitler's elite soldiers. Initially, they are his private bodyguards, but over time they develop into being these super Nazi elite paramilitary force, which Hitler uses to do a lot of his dirty work, removing people, arresting people, and so on. The Gestapo, the third group, is a little bit like the SD in that they spy on people and they gather intelligence, but the Gestapo also arrest people and interrogate and torture them. So not only are the Gestapo spying and investigating, but they're also torturing and interrogating people for information. So we'll start with the SD. The SD are the main intelligence gathering service. They are the secret service, really. They're led by Reinhard Heydrich, and they focus on gathering intelligence on people who are enemies of the Nazis or people who are opposing them. But the SD don't take action against their enemies. And I mentioned this just a few seconds ago. The SD take the findings, the things they found out, and they pass them on to the Gestapo. And it is the Gestapo who then deal with the findings of the SD. The SS is led by Heinrich Himmler, and they're a small elite group of pure Aryans, Nazis who are totally convinced in the Nazi beliefs, who are of pure German blood, and who are physically very, very fit. Now, they only have 52,000 of them in 1934. When you compare them to the SA, who have around 3 million men, they are a very small group. But Heinrich Himmler is very particular in who's allowed into the SS because they very much are the elite soldiers. They rise to power a lot more after the Night of the Long Knives. When the SA loses power, the SS sort of absorbs some of this power. And they're the elite Aryans who are super convinced Nazis, a bit like the Nazi Special Forces. And whereas the SA wear brown uniforms, known as the brown shirts, the SS wear the black uniforms, known as the black shirts. And after the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler looks to the SS to enforce a lot of the terror, to carry out purges, getting rid of enemies, removing people, and just generally making sure that there's a culture of fear, that people feel scared to speak out or to oppose. Now, the Gestapo, strangely, is the smallest of the three organisations, but is the most feared and definitely the most renowned. So the Gestapo were the secret police. They would investigate, they would arrest, and they would interrogate and torture different German people. They would tap people's telephones, they would intercept people's mail. And often, a lot of what the intelligence the Gestapo got was tip-offs, where people basically snitched or dobbed in other people who'd said things or done things. So they used a lot of those tip-offs in gathering their intelligence. In terms of the police, the Nazis kept the regular police that dealt with the criminal activity, burglaries, robberies, things like that. And they were called the Orpo. So they are the regular police, the Orpo. The Nazis set up a Kripo. Now the Kripo is a criminal police. And the Kripo operate alongside the Orpo, alongside the regular police. But they listen into conversations, they spy on people. They're another presence in the police state, on the streets, creating this culture of fear. So they're another organisation that is listening in and that is spying. Now, in terms of the courts are really important for the Nazis because it's all right having the police and the Gestapo and the SS creating a culture of fear and the SD spying on people. But if you are taking people to trial, you need to have courts that support you, and they needed to have courts that were Nazified. So the Nazis changed the courts and try and control them in order to help them Nazify society. So all judges have to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler. If they refuse to sign this oath of loyalty, they're removed from their post. Most judges just did it purely out of fear because they were worried about what would happen if they refused to do the oath of loyalty. And because the judges are having to swear an oath of loyalty and they're removing ones who refuse to do the oath, it means that people are not getting a fair trial. So people who are against the Nazis are getting very, very harsh punishments, and Nazis who are on trial are often receiving softer sentences or softer punishments. So the courts are a really important part of the Nazis controlling and Nazifying society. Now, as well as terror, propaganda is super important in the Nazis changing the hearts and minds of the German people. And there are four main forms of Nazi propaganda: newspapers, radio, and then over the page, rallies and posters. Now, it's all about manipulating people's beliefs and people's hearts and people's minds to make people agree with and side with the Nazis. So the first thing that they do with newspapers, many of the small local newspapers were closed down. They do keep some small local newspapers, but most of them are closed down. The Nazis set up their own newspaper called Der Stürmer, the Stormer, and this is a super Nazi, incredibly anti-Semitic national daily newspaper that just produces disgusting articles on Jews, on communists, on anyone who's an enemy of the Nazis. And it's a real propaganda tool where they're getting their views and their beliefs through a national newspaper. Those newspapers that they choose to keep, all of them are heavily controlled by the Reich Press Chamber. So the Reich Press Chamber is set up and it controls exactly what is written. And the editor's law means that editors of newspapers are personally responsible for what is written in their newspaper. So if an editor allows their newspaper to go to print and it has something against the Nazis in it, the editor will be punished. So it really, really forces editors to only print things that are pro-Nazi. You'd be too scared to print anything which is even slightly undermining the Nazis or opposing them. The second form of propaganda is the radio. Now, the radio is a relatively new form of technology in the 1930s, and the Nazis use it really effectively to get their propaganda directly into people's homes. So we'll start with the People's Receiver. The cheap radio sets the Nazis produced were called the People's Receiver, and by making them cheap, it meant that all German people would have a radio in their home. And up to 80% of German people did have a radio in their home by the mid-1930s. So this meant that the Nazis could send their propaganda directly into every single German home. The People's Receiver was also very cleverly built so that it could only access German radio stations. So people who are using the People's Receiver are not able to pick up any British or American radio stations. They're only able to pick up German radio stations, which are controlled by the Nazis. So that brings us on to the Reich Radio Company. So the Reich Radio Company is set up by the Nazis, and it controls all of the broadcasts. Anything that is broadcast on the radio, the Reich Radio Company control it. So they promote German music. Any swing or jazz music from Britain or America was totally banned. They would play German music, Hitler's speeches, forms of propaganda disguised through dramas, in order to get the propaganda, the Nazi beliefs, through to people in their homes. In terms of rallies were held to show the power of the Nazi movement. So a famous example is the Nuremberg rally, where hundreds of thousands of people attended. So these rallies would have music, speeches, chanting, military marches, and the rallies would be filmed and recorded and shown in cinemas around Germany and put on the radio. And the idea of them was, it was a show of power. It was a real show of strength, that how powerful, how effective, how influential the Nazis were, all to try and get people to side with them, to agree with them, that they were a powerful and a good movement for Germany. The last one, and arguably the most effective, is their propaganda posters. Now, posters were used all over Germany to show a visual message. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, was very, very effective in making very simple, very clear posters that anyone could understand by just briefly looking at them. A famous example is the poster of Arbeit und Brot, the work and bread poster, where they're offering the German people work and bread. Very, very simple and very effective. And with this visual message, they would play on people's raw emotions. So they would target women who may be fearful for their children, or men who don't have a job and they want to get into employment, or people who were worried about Jewish people in society. So they played on people's emotions, these propaganda posters. And as a result, it meant that they were really effective because it targeted people right in their heart about the things that they worried about. Now, concentration camps are often something that's misunderstood, particularly in the early years. Now, in 1933, the first concentration camp is set up at Dachau, just outside the city of Munich. But what's really important that we understand is, at the very start, concentration camps are used only for political prisoners and for people who oppose the Nazis during the time that they're establishing the dictatorship. So when Hitler is establishing his dictatorship, they are only putting political prisoners and opponents into the camps. They are not putting in other people such as Jews or people who, like Jehovah's Witnesses, or anybody with disabilities. The camps are simply used to concentrate political enemies in the early years. Now, once the dictatorship is established after 1934, the Nazis start to put other undesirable people in the camps. So at first, it's just people like communists, political opponents. But throughout the 1930s, they start to place other undesirable people in there, like I said, such as Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, deaths in concentration camps before World War II were not common. Prisoners would die of exhaustion, because of the hard labour they were doing, but they were not actively killed, and that's really, really important we remember that. The deaths in the camps, they are to concentrate people away from society and to force them to do hard labour. It is not to kill them. That is not anything that concentration camps are doing before the Second World War. In terms of opposition to the Nazis, we can kind of group our opposition into two bands. One is people who are religious who oppose the Nazis, and the other is young people who oppose the Nazis. Now, in class, we looked at a number of different examples, but I've just distilled these down to the key the key people from the religious side and the key groups from the young people side as well. So in terms of the religious opposition, Hitler signs the Concordat, that agreement with the Pope. And the Concordat basically says between the Nazis and the Catholic Church, if you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. At first, Hitler follows it, but he then very quickly doesn't leave the Catholic Church alone. He starts interfering, closing down youth groups, and he starts interfering and breaking this agreement that he's had with the Pope. So as a result, Pope Pius writes a public letter on Palm Sunday and has it read out all over Germany, criticising the Nazis. So Pope Pius is an example of a religious opponent, obviously far too high profile and far too important for the Nazis to do anything about. Other people such as Cardinal Galen, they opposed the Nazis by preaching against them. Every Sunday, Cardinal Galen would preach against the Nazis. He preached against their beliefs, their views on race, and their views on disabilities. But like the Pope, Cardinal Galen was too high profile to remove. Everybody would know if Cardinal Galen had been taken away. So they couldn't really touch him. He was too high profile to be removed. In terms of young people opposing the Nazis, they opposed the Nazis because they were restricting their freedoms, their ability to attend certain youth groups. If they were religious, they might want to attend a religious youth group. Well, they're no longer allowed to do that. So two key groups that oppose the Nazis are the Swing Kids and the Edelweiss Pirates. Now, the Swing Kids were very interested in American jazz music, and they would dress up and meet in secret, and they would dance and listen to American music. And they would oppose the Nazis because the Nazis did not want any American influence on young people at all. The Edelweiss Pirates were a group who would meet in the mountains. They would go on walks and hikes to disguise their meetings. They would listen to music, they would play sports, but they would also beat up Hitler Youth patrols, and they would actively avoid the Hitler Youth meetings, and instead they would meet and go into the mountains, like I said, on walks. The third unit in the Nazi module is all about changing lives. So it's all about how the Nazis changed the lives of regular people from 1933, when Hitler becomes Chancellor, through to the start of World War II in 1939. Now, as you'll see on the screen, I've put a positive and negative when we're talking about workers, women, and young people. So if you've got a question talking about whether they improved lives or made lives worse, we've got those positives and negatives there to sort of help you remember which things are good for workers, for example, and which things are not good for workers. So when Hitler becomes Chancellor, unemployment is at a huge record high. It's at 6 million people. It's an enormous number. Hitler vastly reduces the unemployment in Germany from 6 million to 35,000. So that is a really good thing for workers because he's getting more people into work, more people doing jobs. Doing things such as big infrastructure projects like building the autobahns, the motorways, and building the Deutsche Bahn, or sort of not building but expanding the Deutsche Bahn, the German rail system. So that is a positive because he's getting people into work. But the Nazis failed to protect small businesses and craftsmen. They increased the tax on big businesses, and they think that if big businesses are paying more tax, small businesses will benefit. But it doesn't actually work out to be successful because the number of small businesses and craftsmen reduces from 1.6 million to 1.5 million. So even though they're taxing big business and trying to improve the lives for small businesses, the number of small businesses actually decreases. The Nazis want to protect German farmers, and they have a campaign called the Blood and Soil Campaign. And they pass a law called the Reich Farm Law. Now, the Reich Farm Law means that families can't sell and give up their land. Now, the idea is that they're protecting farmers, but actually they fail to protect farmers because the number of farmers fell from 21% to 18%. So they fail in protecting farmers. Now, industrial workers are given jobs, and we've said that unemployment is reduced, so that's a good thing. But their wages are frozen at 1933 levels. So the wage that they got in 1933 never increases, it's frozen. Now, throughout the 1930s, things become more expensive. Now, if things are becoming more expensive, but your wage is staying the same, you'll struggle to buy basic necessities, your food, your clothes, your heating, your rent. So prices are going up, but wages are staying the same. So actually life became more difficult for workers because things became more expensive for them. Now, workers were encouraged to join the DAF. Remember that trade union that we've talked about previously, the German Labour Front. And they were encouraged to join it for its benefits, but also to be controlled. So the Nazis had a few elements of the DAF which were designed to encourage people to join, because the more workers that join the DAF, the more workers they control. They had a program called Strength Through Joy. And the idea of Strength Through Joy was that being a member of the DAF, you would get discounted holidays, discounted theatre trips, cheaper gym or free gym memberships. So it enabled workers and their families to take their children away for activities or for them to be able to have leisure time. So this was a positive for workers because they're getting more opportunities, these cheaper holidays, these theatre trips, gym memberships. So it's a positive thing for workers. But it does mean that if you're going on a Nazi organised cheap holiday, they're controlling your leisure time. So they're controlling how you're spending your free time. Now, the Beauty of Labour was a programme introduced by the DAF to improve the workplaces of German workers. So they built new toilets, new changing facilities. That's a good thing, right? But the workers had to build these facilities themselves. So in some ways it's a positive because they're getting new toilets and new changing facilities. But in other ways, it's definitely negative because if the workers want these facilities, they have to do unpaid overtime in order to build them. So the Beauty of Labour is a bit of a positive and a bit of a negative. The final bit is the Reich Labour Service. Now, the Reich Labour Service tackle unemployment by giving all unemployed men jobs to do, mainly jobs in building infrastructure, motorways and railways. So again, going back to that idea of reducing unemployment, the Reich Labour Service is definitely a benefit for workers because it's getting people into jobs. It's getting people having an income so that they can support themselves or their family. Now, lives for women under the Nazis are not good. The Nazis have an ideal about women where they want women to live very traditionally and they expect them to be mothers, to be wives and to be homemakers. Now, that prevents women from having a career. That prevents women from having independence. But the Nazis wanted women to focus on Kinder, Küche and Kirche, children, the kitchen and the church. They wanted women to have lots of children to build the German population. So they don't want women having careers and choosing not to have children. Hitler wants a big population. Hitler wants a big army. And in order to do that, he wants the women to have lots of children. So because of the desire to have lots of children, divorce was made easier in Germany for women, so they would not stay in unhappy marriages. The idea is if you're in an unhappy marriage, you're unlikely to have children or more children. But if you are in a happy marriage, you're more likely to have children. But this is definitely a positive for the Nazis, for women, because it gives women more control over their lives. It's giving them more personal control. If they're not happy in a relationship, they can leave it. So in that way, divorce being easier is definitely a benefit. But the next two are most certainly negatives for women. The Nazis offered loans to newly married couples, and the idea was you got this lump sum of money, or you could have it in items for your home as well, like cookers and fridges and things like that. So you could have the money or the items. And the idea was that you would have to pay this money back. But for every child you had, you would give up. Well, you would, not give up, but for every child you had, they took 25% of your loan off you. So every time you had a child, your loan was reduced by 25%. So this isn't particularly effective because not many women actually adhere to this loans thing. They're not pressured into having children. But it does put pressure on women to have children. If you've got a big loan and you want to pay it off, but without having to actually give any money, well, if you have 4 children, your loan's gone because it's reduced for 25% for each one. So this is a negative for women because it definitely puts pressure on them to have children. And the pressure on women to have children was seen when they're given medals. So for the number of children you had, women were given medals. And I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but say you have 3 children, 5 children, 7 children. There's medals given at different numbers of children you've had. So again, it's a negative because it's putting pressure on women to have children. Now, in terms of the lives of young people, the Hitler Youth was set up by the Nazis to control the leisure time and the brains of the young people. Initially, you could choose to go or not, but after 1936, it was mandatory for all children to be a member, so you had to be a member of the Hitler Youth. The boys would learn outdoor and military skills. They're trying to build soldiers, aren't they? So they would go on outdoor camps and they would learn outdoor and military skills. The girls would be taught motherhood, skills of motherhood, how to look for a perfect Aryan husband, how to care for your husband, how to raise children. The idea is that they are the future mothers. So while the boys are going out learning how to be future soldiers, the girls are learning how to be future mothers. And throughout the Hitler Youth, Nazi propaganda and Nazi messages were constantly pushed through everything they did to try and convince and to brainwash the young people into agreeing with Nazi ideas. So that is definitely a negative because they are being brainwashed through Nazi propaganda in these Hitler Youth groups. And there's another negative because the Hitler Youth replaced all other youth groups, church groups, social clubs, music bands, sports clubs. They were all closed down and they were replaced by the Hitler Youth. So they still played music in the Hitler Youth, they still played sport in the Hitler Youth, but separate groups are closed down. So that's a real negative for the Nazis because for young people, because if young people want to be in a music group or want to play sport, they have to do it through the Hitler Youth. There is a positive though, in that many children enjoyed the opportunities that they got by going outdoors and by doing these adventurous things with Hitler Youth. So in some ways, children did get opportunities that they wouldn't have got elsewhere. But not all children enjoyed it. There were a lot of children who hated going. They found the Hitler Youth meetings boring. They found them not of their interest. They just didn't want to attend. So there's a negative there because they're just not interested. Now, education is a key part of the Nazis changing the lives of young people. The Nazis knew that if they were to build a Germany to last a long time under the Nazis, they needed to use the education system to indoctrinate young people, to create a new generation of Nazis. So the existing schools, the regular schools in the country, were converted, and their curriculum was Nazified. So subjects like history were changed to focus on German military history. And they introduced new subjects like Rassenkunde, race studies. So they're getting their Nazi ideas and their Nazi beliefs through this new curriculum that they have Nazified. Boys' school education focused on military history and physical health for fighting. So there was a lot of time dedicated to PE and a lot of time dedicated to military history. The girls' education was focused much less on academic subjects and more on raising children and how to have the best physical health for childbearing. There were some new Nazi schools set up, so schools set up by the Nazis, such as the Adolf Hitler schools. And the idea was for the Adolf Hitler schools that they were the most intelligent, the most aspirational students who would be the next generation of Nazi leaders. But there was very few of these schools. The vast majority of German children went to an existing school that had been Nazified. Now, life for Jewish people in Germany in the 1930s became increasingly difficult and increasingly horrific throughout the 1930s. The Nazis categorized people into two groups. There was the Übermenschen, Über, above, Menschen, people or humans. So the Übermenschen were the above people or the above humans, who were generally North European, German, Scandinavian, viewed as the superior race. Untermenschen were viewed as below people, and they were viewed as below the Aryan race, below the Übermenschen. Jewish people, people from Eastern Europe, the Slavs, groups like that. Now, increasingly, from 1933 to 1938, the Nazis persecuted Jewish people socially, financially, and economically. For example, in 1935, they passed the Nuremberg Laws, and the Nuremberg Laws mean that Jews are no longer German citizens, and they must add either Israel, if they are male, or Sarah, if they are female, to their legal names. The idea of this is that they are visibly Jewish. If you have to give your name and you have to start it with Israel or Sarah, it's clear that you are Jewish. Equally, Jews no longer being German citizens means that if you're not a citizen of a country, you don't have to be treated the same. So it gives the Nazis more opportunity and more ease to deliberately target Jewish people and separate them from society. The Nazis also tried to force Jews to leave the country in the 1930s. So they organised boycotts where people have to ignore Jewish businesses and not use them. They're trying to make life as difficult as possible for Jewish people in order to force them to leave Germany in the 1930s. Now, up to 1938, the persecution against Jewish people was social, economic, and political. But in 1938, this changes, and it changes to physical violence. So on the 9th and 10th of November 1938, we have Kristallnacht. Now, Kristallnacht translates as the night of the broken glass. And the Nazi government encouraged people on this night to attack Jewish homes, Jewish businesses, and synagogues. And in huge numbers, people do this, and they attack and brutally murder, pillage, and in some cases rape different people of Jewish faith from all over Germany. Now, Kristallnacht is very, very important because it's that turning point. It's that turning point where the social and the economic persecution and the political persecution turns to physical violence significantly for the first time. The fourth unit is all about Germany at war. So it's all about between 1939 and 1945. So Germany during the war. What is life like in Germany for German people, and how does it get worse as the war goes on? So the war breaks out in 1939. In 1941, the Nazis move from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. So a peacetime economy is all about producing things that people need. So clothes or radios or, trying to think of something that's in front of me, curtains, for example. Things that people need that are used for everyday life. So a peacetime economy makes things for people's everyday life. But they move to a wartime economy. And the wartime economy focuses much more on producing things for the war effort. So producing things like ammunition, weapons, uniforms, things that are used for the war rather than for people back home. The reason this happens is by 1941, Germany was fighting on a massive scale. They'd taken over large numbers of countries in Europe. They needed huge supplies of ammunition, uniforms, weapons, vehicles in order to do this. And the current system of having a peacetime economy wasn't working. So Albert Speer was appointed Minister for War Production in 1942. And by the end of 1941, 55% of German people worked in some way in a job related to the war effort. Albert Speer made changes by introducing women into the factories, and he started using prisoners from camps in the factories for extra labour. So this shift from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy is all about increasing their war production, things used for war. Now, this has some significant impacts on civilians, because if you're producing more things for the war and less things for the people, you're going to get shortages. So they had to introduce rationing to almost all aspects of life. They had to ration clothes, food, shoes and coal. So that clearly is a negative. That is a negative where shortages are an impact of that wartime economy and they're causing people problems. There is a benefit for women because previously, up from 1933 to 1941, the Nazis had only wanted women to be at home as wives and mothers in that very traditional role. But by Albert Speer asking them to join the war effort, this is giving them employment, and this is starting to move women out of the home and back into the workplace. So in that sense, it's definitely a positive for women. But from 1941 and into 1942, the British intensified their air raids on German cities. So the bombing meant that children were evacuated out of the cities, and this evacuation program was known as the KLV. Now, if children are being removed from cities, away from their parents, and bombing is causing many people to die, that the wartime economy clearly is having a negative impact, that the British are trying to bomb their factories producing ammunition and their factories producing clothing. Now, as we move through the war, we've got the wartime economy in 1941. 1942, things aren't going great for the Nazis. By 1943, things are starting to turn against them. it was becoming clear that the Nazis weren't actually winning the war, and really they were starting to lose the war. So they needed to direct all of their resources to the war effort. So they moved their wartime economy to a total war economy. And that's like a super wartime economy, where everything is focused on the war. So Joseph Goebbels announces that anything that is not essential to the war would not be produced. So, for example, clothes would not be produced. And any businesses that were not related to the war were forced to close to focus everything on the war effort. So entertainment like cinemas and music halls, they were closed. And because they are focusing all production on making things for the war, such shortages became even worse. So after 1943, when they're focusing all production on the war effort, entertainment is closed in most cases, and shortages become really, really bad. Now, by 1944, the total war economy that we saw on the previous slide is still not working. In 1944, it's getting worse in Germany. Clothes production is totally halted. People are having to swap clothes, and starvation is increasingly becoming a significant issue. If you're wealthy and you've got money, people started to use the black market to buy and sell food and to buy and sell supplies. The USA and Britain are intensifying their bombing on cities like Dresden and Berlin. People are becoming homeless. People are starving. There's 500,000 people in Berlin alone that are homeless. Dresden is attacked with incendiary bombs, with fire bombs, which burn the old wooden city to the ground. And the rail and postal services are significantly reduced as well. So by 1944, you are being constantly bombed. There are terrible shortages. There is a real shortage of fuel for heating. Things are really not good in Germany, and there are terrible impacts on the German population. By 1945, the writing is kind of on the wall for the Nazis. It's becoming very clear that they will lose the war very soon. Britain and the USA are attacking Germany from the west. Russia is attacking Germany from the east. So they are being attacked on two sides, and they're being pressed back into German territory on both the eastern side and the western side. And Hitler knows that any day soon they will be crossing into actual Germany. So not the countries they've taken over, but actual Germany. So Hitler sets up the Volkssturm, the People's Storm. And so all men aged 16 to 50 who were not already in the army were forced to join local defences. And the Volkssturm were set up to defend the German cities when they are being attacked, because they knew that very soon British, American and Russian soldiers would be starting to take over Germany. Now, greater conscription happens because millions of men are now conscripted from factories into the army. So they know that the war is being lost. So they actually take men out of the factories and send them to war. Now, by April of 1945, Britain and America have taken pretty much all of Western Germany, and they are in Berlin. The Russians have taken all of Eastern Germany and are also in Berlin. Hitler is surrounded in his underground bunker, in the Führer bunker, and so Hitler takes his own life on the 30th of April 1945. Now, people who opposed the Nazis during the war, we've got four key elements here. The first person who opposes them is Cardinal Galen, and we've talked previously about Cardinal Galen. He opposes the Nazis throughout the 1930s. He uses his sermons during World War II to continue to preach against their use of terror and also against their racial policy. He's a significant form of opposition, but even by the time of the war, he's still too high profile to kill. Towards the end, Cardinal Galen ends up being pretty much under house arrest. He can't leave his house because he does fear for his safety. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he actively opposed the Nazis. And we looked at him as well in the 1930s. He forbid Nazi party members from attending his church. And he preached against the Nazis' murder of what the Nazis called undesirables. So people with disabilities or people who were Jewish. Now, he was secretly part of the resistance, and he was incredibly brave during the war, and he passed on intelligence to the British spies. But he was arrested and taken to Flossenburg concentration camp, and he was killed at the camp 2 weeks before the end of the war. Now, the Rosenstrasse, they were a very, very brave group of women. Some Jewish men who were part Jewish, so one of their grandparents, say, was Jewish. They were called Bishlings, half Jews. And these men were arrested. And they were taken to prison because they were part Jewish. Now, these women went to the prison and they showed great, great courage by protesting outside the prison. They were fired on by the SS. They ran away. They came back. They continued to protest, and they eventually persuaded the Nazis to free their husbands. So we've got example there of, like Cardinal Galen, they are effectively opposing the Nazis during the war. The last one is Operation Valkyrie. Now, Operation Valkyrie is an assassination attempt on Hitler in 1944, led by the German colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Klaus von Stauffenberg puts a briefcase underneath a table where he's planned to meet Hitler, and he hopes that the explosion from the briefcase will kill Hitler. Whilst it badly injures him, it doesn't kill him. And so all the plotters are arrested and shot. So Operation Valkyrie is an example of unsuccessful opposition. They do not successfully kill Hitler. The plan fails. The final unit is all about the Nazi occupation of Europe during the war, so between 1939 and 1945, all about when the Nazis are occupying the countries, and it's about how they treat people in those occupied countries. Now, when we study the occupation of Europe, we use two case studies. Now, the first case study is of Eastern Europe, and we use Poland as the example. The second is of Western Europe, where we use the Netherlands as the example. Now, the reason why we pick these two examples is because the Nazis treat the Dutch in the Netherlands very different to how they treat the Poles. Now, the Nazis' idea of Übermenschen and Untermenschen comes back into play. They believe that the Poles are Untermenschen. They are from Eastern Europe, they are Slavic. They believe that they are below people, and they have a culture that they want to destroy. But the people in the Netherlands are what the Nazis would view as Übermenschen. They're North Europeans. And whilst the Nazis take over their country and control them, they are nowhere near as brutal or as vicious to the people in the Netherlands as they are to the Poles, because they view the Poles as Untermenschen, whereas the Dutch in the Netherlands they view as the Übermenschen. So I've put this table together, and this table's on your unit on a page as well, to help you understand how they're similar and how they're different. So I've labelled each one down the middle with how were they treated by the Nazis? What happened to their culture? What happened to their government? How do they resist the Nazis? And what happened to Jews? So I'll talk you through this table. So how were people treated by the Nazis? Well, in the Netherlands, they were viewed as Übermenschen, and they were treated with a far more respect than the Poles were treated. People in Poland were treated horrendously. They were viewed as Slavs and degenerates. They were treated with disgust, and there was terrible violence towards them. What happened to their culture? Well, in the Netherlands, the Dutch culture and the Dutch education system was not changed. They feared that there would be an uprising, and they feared that Dutch people would rebel against them. And they didn't view Dutch culture anywhere near as negatively as they did Polish culture. So in the Netherlands, they actually leave Dutch culture unchanged. Polish culture and Polish education was totally removed and totally destroyed. The Nazis wanted to remove every element of Polish culture, and so many really important Polish books and Polish forms of literature were burnt because they didn't want that culture continuing. They wanted to eradicate and destroy that culture. What happened to the governments in the two places? Well, in the Netherlands, the government was replaced by a Nazi-led government, but they allowed Dutch civil servants, so Dutch government workers, to continue working in the government. So whilst the Nazis took control, they allowed Dutch civil servants to continue working in the government. In Poland, they completely removed all forms of Polish governance. They installed a general government, and the general government was made up of Nazis. And so we call it a puppet government, where basically whatever the Nazis told them to do, they did. So in Poland, there was a Nazi government that was doing exactly what Hitler in Berlin wanted them to do. Now, how do they resist the Nazis? Now, they're different. Both resist. So there are people in the Netherlands who resist the Nazis, and there are people in Poland who resist the Nazis. But they're different in terms of their scale. Now, in the Netherlands, they hid men, but it was far more of a small network. It was quite a simple network. Around 2,000 Dutch people were executed for being involved in the resistance, and it was quite a small network. It wasn't a huge network of people who opposed the Nazis. In Poland, there was a huge resistance network, and it spanned the whole of Poland. Many Poles were involved in a very, very complex resistance network. And as a result, whereas the Nazis executed 2,000 Dutch, they executed around 200,000 Poles. Now, what happened to the Jews in these two countries, in the east in Poland and in the west in the Netherlands? Well, very similarly. In the Netherlands, many Jews were sent to concentration camps and then later to death camps. 76% of Dutch Jews were killed. Equally in Poland, 3 million Polish Jews were killed. Now, you might think, well, that's a far higher number than in the Netherlands, but there were more Jewish people in Poland. So the vast majority of Jewish people in both the Netherlands and Poland were removed and killed. So that is the similarity between them. How they resist is different. What they do to the government is different. What happens to the culture is different. How they're treated by the Nazis is different. But what happens to the Jews is similar. They remove the vast majority of the Jewish population from both Poland and the Netherlands. Now that takes us on to the Holocaust. Now, Jews in Western Europe were sent to concentration camps. Jews in Eastern Europe were sent to ghettos. Now, there were far more Jewish people in Eastern Europe, in Poland and areas in the East, than there was in the West. So Jews in Western Europe were sent to a concentration camp. So outside a town or a city, they would be concentrated and held there. In Eastern Europe, because there were far more Jewish people, they were sent to ghettos. And ghettos were areas of cities that were bricked off. They literally bricked up parts of streets to hold the Jewish people in an area of the city. Now, they were holding them in concentration camps in the west and holding them in ghettos in the east because they did not have a plan as to what to do with these Jewish populations. They didn't want them in their society that they controlled, but they didn't know what to do with them. Now, a phrase called the final solution was agreed in 1941 at the Wannsee Conference. So leading Nazis met together and they decided that their solution to this Jewish, in inverted commas, problem was to kill them using poison gas. Now, the architect of this plan was Reinhard Heydrich, who we have talked about earlier, previously head of the SD and the Gestapo, but he is the person who puts in place the plan for the final solution. So by 1942, groups of people were being sent to death camps: Jews, Slavic people from Eastern Europe, people with disabilities, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals. So all of those groups of people were being sent to concentration camps. But the Holocaust isn't just about death camps murdering people. There was a group called the Einsatzgruppen. Now, the Einsatzgruppen were elite squads of SS soldiers, and they just went round Eastern Europe randomly, going to towns, rounding people up who were Jewish or Russian, and shot them. Now, they started with the men, but they very, very quickly moved on to murdering women and children too. And they literally would go to a town, round people up, shoot them into a mass grave, and move on to the next town, and move on to the next town, and move on to the next town. So that was happening in Eastern Europe. And at the same time, they'd built these death camps. So following the final solution, when they agreed at the Wannsee Conference that they would murder the Jews of Europe and other undesirable people, they set up death camps. Now, I spoke earlier on in the video about concentration camps and them being very different to death camps. The death camps were set up as separate to concentration camps. The easiest way to remember it is that concentration camps were to concentrate people, to hold people. Death camps were used for death. And so these death camps, such as Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka, they were set up, Majdanek as well is an example, they were set up with the sole purpose of murdering people, using a poison gas called Zyklon B. So the Holocaust is made up of those two elements, the Einsatzgruppen and the death camps. Now, the final bit is all about how people respond to the Nazis during the occupation. So how do people deal with the Nazis when they are in their country? So in countries like France, Greece, Monaco, the Channel Islands, Denmark, the Netherlands, these people are controlled by the Nazis, but how do they respond to them? Do they collaborate and work with them? Do they accommodate and they just kind of accept what the Nazis are doing? Or do they resist? So collaboration, accommodation and resistors are the three sort of groups we're going to look at. Now, a famous example of a collaborator is Coco Chanel of Chanel Fashion House. Now, Coco Chanel refused to leave Paris when the Nazis took over France, and she actually started a relationship with a German officer. She campaigned for her company to remove all of its Jewish shareholders. So she was very much a collaborator. She was working with the Nazis, having a relationship with a Nazi officer and trying to remove Jewish shareholders from her company. Accommodators were groups like King Louis II of Monaco. King Louis II of Monaco was asked by the Nazis to provide a list of the locations of Jewish people, and they did that. So they're accommodating the Nazis. They are accepting what the Nazis are doing. They're not necessarily collaborating in the murder or in the evil acts, but they are accommodating them. They are working with, they are sort of accepting them by providing lists of where Jewish people live. Then we have the resistors. Now, we've talked already about the Polish resistance being very, very complex. And the Poles resist the Nazis, having a very complex resistance system. And they fiercely fight the Nazis in order to resist their occupation of Poland. Equally in the Channel Islands, so the islands just off France, between Britain and France, like Jersey and Guernsey, some women in the Channel Islands had relationships with Nazi soldiers, but they didn't have relationships because they genuinely wanted to, like Coco Chanel. They had relationships for information. So many women had relationships with Nazi soldiers to get information out of them, to pass on to the resistance networks. And when they were building the Atlantic Wall defences, many Channel Islanders were asked to help build this wall, and they refused. So again, we've got an example there of Channel Islanders resisting. If you guys have got any more questions, please speak to your teacher. The information that we've talked through in this video is all on the unit on a page, and it's all in your booklets and exercise books as well. There is going to be a second video which will talk about how to do the Nazi exam questions, so please keep an eye out for that. Thanks.